Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Thanks. Good afternoon to everyone who has joined. It's about 12:15 and I see that we've got great attendance, so we will start the program now. Our program is being recorded today and it will be available on BGR's website after the event. My name is Becky Mowbray and I am the President and CEO of the Bureau of Governmental Research. BGR is a private, nonprofit, independent research organization dedicated to informed public policy making and the effective use of public resources for improving government in the New Orleans metro area. BGR's research reports and government monitoring are hallmarks of its public policy work in Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Tammany parishes. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. The research and analysis we will discuss today and our ability to host this webinar was made possible by a generous grant from the foundation. So now let's dive into today's topic. As many of you may recall, last year, Congress passed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, as it is commonly called. The act provided state and local governments with federal funding to address the financial, economic, and health impacts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The city of New Orleans received $388 million in ARPA funding, which is the largest of any parish or city in Louisiana. A few months after ARPA's passage, BGR published a report entitled Handle with Care. That report provided policymakers with guidance on planning and oversight so they could realize the full potential of ARPA funding. Yesterday, BGR published its follow-up report entitled Managing the Windfall. This report is the topic of today's discussion and tracks the use of ARPA dollars by the city of New Orleans in 2021 and 2022 and the overall impact of this program on city finances. With a better understanding of ARPA uses and impacts, citizens can hold city officials accountable for their funding decisions. They can also become more informed to participate in future decision-making processes for the remaining funds. Leading today's discussion is Susie Dudas, a research analyst at BGR and the principal author of these reports. Susie received an MS and PhD in International Development from Tulane University and a BA in Economics from Pomona College. Before joining BGR in 2017, she worked for educational organizations in New Orleans and India, and she worked as a research assistant on a U.S. Department of Labor grant in West Africa. Following Susie's presentation, we will have time for questions from the audience. Webinar attendees can submit a question by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen. Just type your question in the box that appears and hit return. Susie, the webinar floor is yours.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks everyone for joining us today on this threatening day. We're glad you're here with us. Let me jump into the presentation, put it up on the screen here. 1 second. Okay. So here is our latest report, just released yesterday, Managing the Windfall, tracking the city of New Orleans' use of federal pandemic relief funds. And you see our website address there, bgr.org, where you can find the full report. So why does this report matter? I think, Becky, as she said, we want to give people a better understanding, definitely, of the city's ARPA use, and this will really help citizens then engage, to understand, hold policymakers accountable for that funding, as well as to engage in future funding and be able to speak with informed, well-informed with policymakers. So the city's expenditures of the first half of its ARPA funding, the first 194 million, allowed it to save its own revenue and build its financial reserves with the surplus. So building the reserves while spending the relief dollars is not prohibited under ARPA rules, but federally required reporting and the city's own reporting focus only on direct ARPA expenditures. So they don't really capture these important broader financial effects. And that's where our report provides this more comprehensive picture of ARPA's impacts on the city's finances and budget priorities. So a little bit of background to get us going on ARPA. As Becky also said, $388 million to the city of New Orleans. This is equivalent to nearly $1,000 per resident. The city received half of this funding in the spring of 2021 and the other half approximately a year later. So the city has to obligate these funds or commit to at least knowing how they're going to spend them by 2024, and then actually spend them all by 2026. So ARPA is interesting and has a lot of room for opportunity here because it gives governments considerable flexibility to decide how to spend the money. It's different from something often like FEMA dollars that we get, and there's specific particular capital projects or uses that we have to use that money for. Broadly, local governments can use ARPA funds to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. This could include kind of basic things that you might think of: vaccination, testing, those types of public health programs, or assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries, such as tourism, obviously impacted here in New Orleans. Governments could use the funds to provide supplemental pay, often called premium pay, for workers who performed essential work during the pandemic. These would be workers like grocery store employees who we all depended on, needed to be at their jobs, putting them at risk from the pandemic. Governments could use the money to invest in some particular types of infrastructure here: water, sewer, stormwater, sort of drainage, as we might say, or broadband infrastructure. And then finally, replace revenue to provide government services to the extent that the pandemic reduced their revenue. So federal rules, you see this highlighted. Can you give a little explanation of this one, as this is also sort of how we've seen the category that the city has used for the first half of its ARPA funding. Federal rules specify how governments must calculate their pandemic-related revenue loss. But this category is the most flexible. It really covers any type of government service, program, infrastructure that is not included water, sewer, and stormwater, as long as it's not bond funded. So very open in what can be allowed under this category, but it's limited in the sense that governments can't spend more under this category than is determined by that federal revenue loss calculation. Federal rules, which are very lengthy, also include very specific eligibilities for the other categories that are there. What actually is under those categories can be included, is okay, or is not okay. So also, for some background, some city budget and finance 101 to help everyone follow along. You'll hear a lot of talk about the general fund. In New Orleans, this provides the operating revenue for most city departments and services, as well as some agencies outside of the city's control, such as the district attorney, the public defender, the sheriff. And then the general fund contains all city revenues except those that are restricted to specific uses. So bond funds are restricted to specific uses, capital projects. Then you have federal grants that may be restricted to specific uses, not part of the general fund. But the general fund, including the bulk of property and sales taxes, service charges, permits, licenses, all going into the general fund. And there you see, this is what we're kind of referring to as the baseline general fund budget here from 2022 that was adopted at the very end of 2019 for the coming year for 2022, before anyone saw the pandemic on the horizon. And at that point, so the original 2020 general fund budget expenditures totaled almost $726 million. And you can see that this is a rough breakdown that 4 city departments and 1 outside agency, the sheriff for the jail, comprise about 60% of the general fund budget there, with all these other departments and the outside agencies making up the remaining 40%. So also important to understand is the city's budget process and who's involved. So by November 1st for the coming year, the mayor submits the proposed budget to the city council. So the mayor and her administration have looked at what revenue they're projecting for the coming year, and then allocated that different amounts to different departments to the outside agencies. By December 1st, the city council adopts the budget for next year. They hold the purse strings with financial matters in the city, and they can accept the mayor's proposed budget, actually all as it is. They can make changes to it, amend that budget, but they're the ones, it has to be by December 1st adopted by the city council. And then at any time during the year, the city council can amend the budget and change some of those initial allocations. The mayor and administration as well could propose amendments throughout the year, but again, ultimately the city council must adopt those amendments. And then finally, at the end of the year, December 31st, the city's budget year runs from January 1st to December 31st. So at the end of the year, any surplus revenue that hasn't been spent during the year increases the city's reserves. And those general fund reserves, which we're going to talk about a lot here, central to the report, are any revenues that have not been spent during the year roll into this centralized fund balance that also is called the general fund balance. Important because the general fund balance, these reserves address budget uncertainties and emergencies. We as individuals, households, we need money in our bank for emergencies. Same thing with the city here. Think of things like hurricanes, obviously in this area, to address immediately, have the funds in the bank in this fund balance to be able to address before any FEMA reimbursements or federal money kicks in. Also very important, why the reserves are so important is they give the financial markets an indicator of the soundness of the city's financial practices. So this affects the city's credit rating, which is very important because it in turn affects the borrowing costs for us, the taxpayers. When the city wants to borrow money for a major capital project, if it doesn't have sufficient reserves, that's going to increase the cost of the borrowing for us, the taxpayers. So now let's get to the key findings then. The city used more than 95% of the first half, 194 million, of its ARPA funds to fill projected general fund gaps in 2021 and 2022. So the city, think back to the beginning of the pandemic, facing declining sales tax revenue with the impact that the pandemic was having on tourism, was projecting, in the coming years, not having the funding that it had back in that baseline year in 2020. So needing funding to keep services going and to fill these general fund gaps. So the city simplified administration by appropriating the ARPA funds to the fire and police department's budget. And then it took the general fund revenue that otherwise would have gone to those departments and redirected it to other departments and agencies to fill those gaps there. So the city spent the ARPA dollars it appropriated to the fire and police departments, about 77 million in 2021, 110 million in 2022. But those projected general fund gaps didn't materialize, primarily due to below budget expenditures in 2021 and better than expected revenues in 2022 we're looking at, and we'll get to that in a second. So therefore, the city ultimately it didn't need to spend those general fund dollars it had redirected to other departments and agencies. These were savings. They did not need to be spent. And I think here, this is a look at 2021, which is a good illustration here. Just walk through it. That yellow line is, again, that pre-pandemic baseline general fund, about $126 million. And you can see the 2021 adopted budget, the original budget before ARPA was passed by Congress, that the city adopted, $634 million. They're about $92 million below what it had been the previous year. So reflecting these cuts that the city had made, anticipating declining revenue. Then when you look at the 2021 amended budget, you see, and that in the blue, the general fund expenditures, they stay the same, but now the ARPA funding is available, came in the spring of the year. And so the city amended that $77.3 million, added to the fire department's budget, and freed up almost an equal amount of money to then go and help gaps in other departments. But then we get to these estimated, this is again estimated, not audited yet, actual spending for 2021. And the city actually wound up spending only $532 million, about $101 million below budget, or 16% below budget. Although it spent the ARPA funding there, the 77.3, and that gray, the $102 million you see, is that general fund surplus, the savings then that the city had. And so even without the ARPA dollars, the city would have had about $25 million general fund surplus, but with the ARPA dollars, getting all the way up there to $102 million. And I would like to add, again, going to our website, you will find that we created, to supplement this report, an interactive dashboard that has more visualizations of ARPA's impacts on budgets, the city's budget and a whole general fund, as well as broken down by departments. So www.bgr.org, check out our dashboard. Now, the picture was a little different in 2022. Instead of, not over yet, so it's a little too soon to know, whether expenditures will be similarly under budget as they were in 2021. But the story here, that what we do know is the city has increased its projection for sales tax revenue by $62 million in September. So $62 million more now general fund revenue than was anticipated when the city adopted the budget back at the end of 2021. So if you look at this, even if the city spent every dollar, let's say not under budget at all, but even if the city spent every dollar in that budget, it would still be able to put $62 million towards increasing the general fund balance. The alternative of that, it could have reduced its ARPA expenditures by $110 million, from 110 to $48 million, and been able to cover everything. So bringing this all together, kind of these first half of the ARPA funds sort of still live on in the city's reserves. These surpluses created during these 2 years have boosted the fund balance. The city administration estimates that the fund balance is now above 200 million, which is about four times the pre-pandemic level. So this places the city in a stronger position to face emergencies, while also allowing it to direct some of that reserve growth to high priority needs, sort of in the same way you would have wanted to direct ARPA funds, other one-time funding, to high priority needs. Now, the 2023 general fund budget, which the City Council just passed back on December 1st, it does not use ARPA funds primarily to fill projected budget gaps like we saw in the past, although it does rely on $14 million from the fund balance, from the reserves. So $14 million is still some gap there being filled, but much smaller than we saw the $77 million projected in 2021, the $110 million use of ARPA in 2022. The city also, on December 1st, allocated $124.2 million in the ARPA funds. This is the second half of the ARPA funds, and $51.1 million from those general fund reserves to actually two specific initiatives. It also designated $100 million from the general fund reserves for emergencies, specifically setting this aside to be able to have in case of emergencies. We discussed the importance of that earlier. So this puts that total emergency financial cushion in line with best practices. And this is something BGR has called on the city to increase this emergency cushion for several years. But sometimes the city has fallen short of providing sufficient information on its use of these ARPA funds, limiting public accountability. This has kind of taken on been different where we kind of have seen more the gaps in different years. In 2021, the city generally provided, when it was amending the budget, had the ARPA funds, details of where that freed up general fund revenue from the fire department was going. You could see that as you had to amend the budget. There was a city council meeting where departments presented where they were going to use that additional funding. But there hasn't really been, we know a lot of it wasn't spent, but follow up here sort of on the other end now, well, what actually happened? What of those expenditures that departments talked about using that money for, which of those actually happened? And then in 2022, a little different where now you didn't have to amend the budget. The ARPA funding was kind of dropped in from the beginning. There was no way for citizens to really see, with that freed up revenue from the fire department, what priorities, where did that go? What was the city able, what gaps were filled with that? If it weren't for that, what would have been out of this budget? So difficult to follow from the beginning in 2022. And then finally in 2023, bringing us up to just what the other week, there was no public discussion to provide the details of these specific initiatives, which wound up being included in the 2023 budget that was passed. These new, the $124 million in the from the second half of the ARPA funds, that's about 2/3 of the remaining ARPA funds. There was initially, the city had, kind of talked about, they had talked about looking at the specific ARPA initiatives once the budget was passed on December 1st, and then coming back and having discussions about these initiatives. But ultimately they went ahead kind of and passed everything all at once. So not really giving citizens an opportunity to know what the details. There was an internal memo that that the administration shared with the council that included some of the details, but that was not provided to the public in advance, nor really did it include, would I say, all of the details. So that will bring us to our recommendations here, and with both the ARPA and general fund balance, both these one-time funding sources, the general fund balance really coming out of the ARPA funding being built. So with both ARPA and general fund balance appropriations, we recommend that the city should provide sufficient details on the components and objectives of the spending plans, provide regular updates on actual spending and outcomes, clearly identify any impacts of these one-time funds on the general fund budget, such as, are these creating recurring expenses that we will need another funding source for in the future, or any possible future reserve growth coming from the ARPA funding specifically. And finally, compile all this information into easily accessible reports so people can actually follow the money, can engage, can be informed, see what the initial plan is, and compare that to what actually happens. Know the plan in advance so that the public can engage, and then the public should know what actually happens with that funding, what the outcomes of this those expenditures are. And these recommendations really follow or are in line with our guidance in 2021 for ensuring transparency and accountability for local governments' use of their pandemic relief funds. So thank you for going through this with me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we are going to get into some questions.
Susie, thank you for that presentation. It's now time to shift to the audience Q&A portion of our program. We have a few questions that audience members have submitted in advance, as well as some new ones that have started coming in while you were speaking. If you would like to ask a question, please click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Just type your question into the box and hit return. Okay, so I'm going to combine the first couple. Why didn't the city spend the money as planned, Susie, in 2021? And why were the expenditures so much lower than what the city budgeted? And is it typical that these budget protections are so far off?
So, okay, let's start at the beginning. Why were things actually, you know what, I'm going to start right there. Is it typical that the budget projections are so far off? Budgets are generally conservative. Nobody wants to wind up spending more than they have. And I would also say that typically, expenditures will want, is it to have expenditures a little bit below what you had budgeted? This is kind of normal if you think about a huge organization, so many staff members, so many employees. The idea that every position would be filled, for exactly 12 months of the year, you're gonna have some gaps somewhere that are gonna create some savings where you don't have that position filled. And so, that's gonna be some savings in your budget. So having things, slightly below budget, I would say, is normal. You don't want to be over budget. Cities, governments would like to avoid, and we as households and individuals would like to avoid. But so why so much? Why 16% under budget did we see in 2021? And again, these are estimated actuals, not yet audited. But our report found a couple, in our research, we found a couple reasons, especially when we look at the money that was amended, when we look at the amendments in the 2021 budget that resulted from the ARPA appropriation to the fire department, that freed up revenue. What was it going to fund? So some of these, a lot of that freed up money helped deal with furlough costs. The city had furloughed employees for about 2 days out of the month, which reduced, then employees weren't paid, reduced was sort of a cut in that initial budget. If you think back to that slide, that $92 million different from the previous year. So when the ARPA money came in and the city had additional funding, it ended those furloughs and then needed additional money to pay for those days because it initially planned on not paying. That was the point of the furloughs. And when we looked, the city kind of based how much money it needed then to deal with the furlough days on full staffing, everybody, every position in the government being filled. And that wasn't the case. A lot of, positions were open, meaning you kind of had built extra money in there with the furloughs. The other half of those, the money in those amendments that wasn't dealing with furloughs in 2021, new initiatives, staffing that had been cut from the previous budget, kind of building things back in for what the city felt were essential services to bring things back. Some of those, that had been planned, the funding level for basically the last quarter of the year. At the time to deal with when it was actually amended into the budget. Finally, I think the city, it was in November when those amendments were passed. And talking to the city, some of those initiatives, some of those staff people, they just didn't get hired in time, or they didn't get completed by the end of the year. So if you didn't make that expenditure, if you didn't hire those people, if you didn't get that initiative that you had planned done, that's leaving that money. You don't need the money for that. So that's sort of the basic explanation of, that we understand in doing our research, finding budget expenditures in 2021. And some of that even probably deals with even before even looking beyond the amendments that dealt with ARPA, you could have had positions that were even in the budget that were never filled. So there are other reasons, that we could imagine that are responsible for being so under budget in 2021.
Great. So Susie, was it intentional that the ARPA funding ended up increasing the city's reserves? And if so, is there anything improper about that?
So it's hard to prove intent. I think, the city, again, had to make funding decisions. One thing was it had to allocate, if it wanted to use this money in a year, put that in its budget before knowing how much revenue, it conservatively budgeted on revenue. And in 2022, we see obviously the projections, the initial projections were lower, more funding came in. So you're kind of having to make this call, at the beginning of the year. And the city did, those parameters being important here to use as revenue loss, keeping, as long as using that federal calculation shows XYZ is your revenue loss, then that ARPA funding can be used for that, and you can spend the ARPA dollars, and you may wind up then with a surplus at the end of the year.
Right. So is the city done with budget shortfalls, and what's your assessment of the city's revenue projections coming out of the pandemic?
Well, like I said, the budget that was just passed on December 1st, the general fund budget, does not really use the ARPA funding as it did in the past to deal with these gaps, but there is $14 million from the fund balance, from the reserves, that the city is using to fund the general fund budget. So that's a smaller amount, certainly, than if you think of the 77 million that was projected, that was there in 2021, the $110 million in 2022, even if those don't wind up actually being the size of the gaps, at least prospectively, they're now projecting sort of this $14 million. And going forward, there's still, even though the revenue with 2022, with that new sort of adjustment with new sales tax revenue, so that's kind of increased from where the city initially thought we'd be at this point with the pandemic, but they still are projecting to have some, to not have the level of revenue that they would have had it not been for the pandemic through 2025.
Susie, so thinking ahead to 2023, are you confident in the council's plans for budget updates? I think they usually hold a mid-year budget hearing, and will that include discussion of the ARPA funds?
So this year with the budget, what the council and the city are talking about is having basically quarterly updates, because the budget that the administration put together, that the council passed, kind of took a different approach this year in looking back historically about the past 4 years of actual expenditures by department, kind of adjusting then the budget to reflect that, as well as to provide some cushion for across the board pay raises for city employees are in the budget. But so you sort of had some funding. This actually kind of lowered in some departments, the department's funding, and positions. The city says these positions, well, they're not, in the budget, they're not entirely, they haven't been cut. So if, for example, the big one being the police department, police have historically been very under budget because of recruitment retention issues. So while the budget may be a little lower for the police in 2023 than it was before, the city's saying, if you can hire more people, hire what you can. And we are going to every quarter come back and look and see what adjustments we need to make in terms of funding. Do we need more funding for this department, less funding for this department? So instead of what we've seen in the past 2 years, these mid-year budget hearings just once, they're talking about now having sort of quarterly hearings to look at especially dealing with these issues of hiring and what's that doing with the budget, being able to fill positions. At some point, the intention is also, and I'm not sure what the time frame is, to come back and look at, the city did wind up adding $124 million appropriating that in the 2023 budget, the $124 million of ARPA funding in the 2023 budget. That leaves about a third of that funding left, which the city had outlined a plan for the entire, that 194 that was left. So I'm not sure what their time frame is then for coming back and looking at appropriating. Will that be later in 2023, or at what point they would look at appropriating that funding, the remaining ARPA funds, as well as there were other projects that had been outlined by the administration using some of the reserves that had built up.
We have an interesting question in the chat that notes that the city has generally portrayed the surplus as a positive story about responsible fiscal stewardship that allowed the city to grow its reserve fund. But at the same time, the question notes that there have been widespread complaints about the quality of city services. That is an excellent observation, but that's kind of, we didn't really look, our task here was really just to follow the money and see where it went. We didn't so much make judgments about how they were spending it, or looked at what they didn't spend it on and the implications of that. Our endeavor here was really just to follow the money, as we had been advocating for transparency and proper planning that involved the public. But it's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the city does, reserves, as there's a sort of recommended minimum level of having funding for emergencies, a best practice, which this is going to allow the city to do. But you can also have too much in the way of reserves. And if you look at some past BGR reports, we've addressed some departments sometimes, or other funds, where it's almost like, do you need this level of fund balance? And that's where I think the city's intention is not to keep the entire reserves that it's built up, but to, as it has, 51 million in the 2023 budget, it's deploying to specific initiatives, and there's a larger plan for deploying even more to specific initiatives. I mean, I think in general, certainly some of those positions, some of that question, did they intend for this level of reserves? To some degree, you want to fill those positions, and that kind of becomes the big issue. And I think that's been, not just for the city with the pandemic, but what the hiring issue and the personnel issue has been, to be able to attract and keep employees during this time, across the board has been problematic. And how do you address that? Are these new pay raises going to help with that? And this is beyond, the police department, but other departments as well. Really getting the people that you need in there. How do you do that? How do you attract them? What kind of pay do you need? And what does that mean based on the recurring revenue that you have going forward, to be able to sustain that?
We have a question from an attendee about, ideally, how much should the city have on hand for emergencies? How does that compare to the current reality? And what are the guidelines for accessing these dollars?
So the minimum best practice for emergencies is 17% of recurring revenues. And why 17% is that works out to about 2 months worth to have that on hand. So that's your kind of minimum best practice guideline, is that's, you should have 17% of your recurring revenues or expenditures on hand to deal with emergencies. Guidelines will also say, if you're, local situations, if you're an area that's, maybe has specific other concerns about emergencies, subject to, maybe more likely to have emergencies, this kind of thing. Sure, 17% is a best practice, but you might want to consider a higher level. Looking at what the city has allocated in the 2023 budget, setting aside for this reserve cushion, that would put it 19%. So that would be in line with that 17% best practice. Prior, if you look at the 10 years, and this is in the report, kind of the 10 years pre-pandemic, the reserves were considerably below that. We're never at that best practice level.
Susie, did any of the money go to the Sewerage and Water Board from the ARPA funds to cover the loss of revenues because of the moratorium on water shutoffs for COVID in 2020 and 2021?
So that is part of, there is $15 million that was just appropriated in the 2023 budget of ARPA funding for the Sewage and Water Board substation, the electrical power station. So that's the first allocation, first that we've seen with the Sewage and Water Board, $15 million.
Given the large increase in the city's reserves that's noted in this report, did the city actually need the ARPA program?
So this is an interesting question. Did the city need the reserves? And I guess did any, I would open that up when you look at asking that question, did any, not just the city government, need this funding? How do we define that? Keep in mind, the ARPA funding was not just the federal government allocating this money to deal with budget gaps to governments, local governments, state governments that saw revenue declines really because of the pandemic. It's broader than that. There are other purposes to deal with community need, the public health needs that we kind of went through in the presentation. So, and in fact, I would say it wasn't even the way the federal government allocated this funding wasn't based on looking at it as a city and saying, well, what was your, how much money are you going to lose in the pandemic? That was not the way the federal government determined what these allocations were. So you might say, oh, well, it looks like, the city didn't need it for these budget gaps. They didn't happen, but there are other uses there. The city, the other side of that is that probably the city would have had additional funding, if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And this goes for other areas too, would have had more tourism, more spending. So it might not have resulted in a gap necessarily in your budget, but there is that issue of that there would have been more revenue that would have put the city in or other cities, across the board in better financial position had it not been for the pandemic. But also really, as I would say, keep in mind those other purposes that the federal government had for this money was not just this revenue replacement, but other uses.
Great. Going back to an earlier question about monitoring the spending going forward, we have a staff member from Councilmember Joe Giarrusso's office on the call today. And Joe Giarrusso, of course, is the chair of the City Council's Budget Committee. And Councilmember Giarrusso's office confirms that they are going to hold quarterly meetings to review department budgets. And one of their main purposes is to check in on vacancies and hiring. So we thank you for putting that comment into the chat. We've got other attendees on the line who would like to know more about the city's plans for spending some of the reserves that the ARPA funding allowed it to accumulate. And what do we know about the plans for the second half of the ARPA funding, Susie?
So, and I would urge everyone, because we do have a chart that we have provided in the full report on page 25 that breaks down the ARPA funds that have been appropriated in the 2023 budget, as well as the use of fund balance for specific projects. You see one of the major things in here is with the ARPA funding is $30 million for a criminal justice overhaul of the criminal justice technology overhaul. That's a major one. I think people have probably the most talked about one is the $32.5 million that's been appropriated in 2023 for the police department for recruitment and retention is in there. But then a lot of things we sort of categorize some of these when you look at the chart of public health programs that are included in there. And there's money in for street maintenance, repair, maintenance, $3 million looks like with the ARPA funding. We discussed the Sewage and Water Board power substation. Then also with some interesting ones that I would look at, let's see, to call out, some youth programs are also included in here. And again, so this chart that's in a report is sort of a general look at kind of categorizing these initiatives, but hopefully we'll see more of the actual plan details. This is what we, really recommend that the city share so people can be able to follow what the details are of these individual initiatives, sort of a time frame, what are the objectives, the population, people being served. That we don't have at this point. That's not in the report, and that's something that is going to be important for people to know going in and to be able to follow. So hopefully that's something that we'll be seeing.
Right. Susie, one more question, then we need to wrap up. We have a chat participant who asks, is there a place where a citizen can see all of the infrastructure needs of the city, and whether there are any plans to address those needs, and the cost of that work today versus the cost of making those investments in the future? Is there any sort of detailed
centralized
centralized of tracking infrastructure needs and the plans to deal with them?
I am not off the top of my head familiar, sort of like a dashboard of infrastructure needs. I know I believe the city has something on its website that deals with the major sort of FEMA funded street repairs that are going on.
The road
that's obviously a major chunk. But across the board, I'm not certain.
But it's a great idea. Thank you for asking that one. It is, I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for questions. Thank you, Susie, for leading our discussion today.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks again to everybody for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks again to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation for its generous sponsorship of this webinar and BGR's research on this important topic. And thank you to all of you for being with us on this stormy day. A recording of today's program will be available on our website, bgr.org. The best way to stay on top of all BGR events and research is to become a member. We regularly engage with our members about our public policy work, and we value this dialogue. We also rely on our members to help amplify BGR's policy recommendations. If you're not currently a member, please visit bgr.org to join the ranks of empowered citizens working to improve local government. We thank you for participating in this event and for staying engaged in public policy discussions important to our community. Have a great day, stay safe, and we hope to see you again at a future BGR event in the coming year.